class between now and 7:15. So don't think that I don't want to be here. I desperately do want to be here, but I'm going to sneak up that stairs and out that door and come back toward the end. But as a beginning to a three-part introduction, I want to turn this now over to Frank Bird, who has been the linchpin in making this happen. Frank?
Dr. Powell, Ambassador Gould, Ambassador Pizzullo, members of the Council, guests and friends, it's a tremendous pleasure on behalf of our board to welcome you this evening. We certainly thank the Walters Gallery for hosting us in this marvelous, marvelous setting and for cooperating in putting on this program. We also thank the Baltimore Museum of Fine Arts in connection with this evening. And of course, our thanks, as always, to Kingdon Gould, who is the key person responsible for this evening's program. Let me thank Ambassador and Mrs. Gould for also making possible the television rebroadcast of this program, which goes to approximately 800,000 households across the state of Maryland, and we're grateful indeed for that. My simple reminder of this evening is to you, we have another program in 2 weeks' time. The Ambassador of Russia will join us. That program will be, I believe, at the Renaissance. If I'm incorrect, Mrs. Legnalupi will thank you very much. That's indeed a correct announcement on the 29th. We have a number of splendid programs between now and the end of the year to which we encourage all of you to join us. But now to introduce our guest of the evening for what I think is going to be a spectacular program is a member, a gentleman who served on our board for the full 6-year, 2 terms, the former American ambassador to the Netherlands, a good friend of the Baltimore community, as well as this council, Ambassador Kingdon Gould.
Thank you very much, and good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Our speaker this evening, whom I'm sure you will find as genial as he is knowledgeable in his field, was born in 1943 in South Carolina, attended Williams University, from which he got a double major in art history and European history, and then entered the United States Navy, in which he stayed for a number of years, rising to the rank of commander in the reserves. On leaving the Navy, he became a teaching fellow in fine arts at Harvard University, from which he also obtained his PhD in 1974. Since that time, he has been involved in numerous wonderful museums and direction of museums, including an early stage at the National Gallery, and later the director of the Los Angeles County Museum of Art, where he served for 12 years. He became the director at the National Gallery of Art in September of 1992. He is married to Mrs. Nancy Landry Powell. They have, whom I might say is a businesswoman in her own right. They have 3 children. Now, in anticipation, I should also tell you that he has, as you might expect, received numerous awards and decorations from all over the world, and he is also the author of 12 or 15 publications, a great many of them focused on the American art of Cole, Morse, and that particular period of American art. Now, in reflecting on the remarks that he might make today on the relationship between art and foreign affairs, I thought it might be wise to inquire of a friend of mine in the State Department how art overseas had impacted his life. And he thought a moment and he said, well, the major impact was that my wife's taste in antiques kept me baroque. Without further ado, I'd like to introduce our speaker, Earl Rusty Powell III.
Ambassador, thank you very much. Distinguished guests, it's a pleasure to be here, and I have, if I get enough room here, look forward to this. Ms. Gould and I spoke, I guess last spring, about the interrelationship of art, culture, diplomacy, and foreign affairs, and it's a subject that we have been involved in at the National Gallery. In many ways, many American museums are, certainly foreign museums are, and the opportunity to talk about it became something of a fascination for me. I have spent most of my professional career in, I guess, large institutions. In the 70s in the National Gallery when the East Building was being built, then in Los Angeles, and back to the National Gallery now. And the exhibitions programs of the gallery, which I will focus on here, I have a good art historian, can't help showing slides, so I have several to show you to discuss the issues and the relationship between art and I suspect international relations. It's somewhat a tangential subject to your central interests, but on the other hand, in many instances, cultural exchange is a precursor of more important formal relationships between countries. Cultural exchange also follows the signing of many agreements. The exhibitions that are the predecessors or the successors of those agreements, we believe, and I know others of my colleagues, are central to our mission. And with that, I'd like to show you some slides, a bit about the history of the National Gallery, because it was in many ways established by Andrew Mellon to be exactly that for the nation's capital. It is the youngest of the world's great national museums, opening in 1941. Yet in its character, it resembles the oldest of European museums, and like them reflects the tastes of discerning private collectors. The National Gallery has a special role by virtue of its very name, its federally appropriated support, and its local, national, and international constituencies. And I'd like to give you a brief introduction to it. You see here the National Gallery East Building, behind it the West Building looking down Pennsylvania Avenue, an afternoon or early evening much like today's. The West Building opened in 1941, the East Building in 1978. When the West Building opened, it was opened as an interesting private-public partnership, if you will, a gift of Andrew Mellon, along with his collection of 125 old master paintings and sculptures. And at the time, I believe, it probably was the largest single gift ever given to a government by a private citizen. This is the mall entrance of the West Building, designed by John Russell Pope, one of the last great Beaux-Arts buildings built in this country. It was accepted as a gift from Mr. Mellon by Franklin Roosevelt. And in his address at the dedication of the National Gallery on March 17, 1941, President Roosevelt concluded, quote, "The dedication of this gallery to a living past and to a greater and more richly living future is the measure of the earnestness of our intention that the freedom of the human spirit shall go on." It was a hugely successful enterprise, and from the very beginning, the National Gallery began to show international exhibitions of great consequence. The so-called blockbuster exhibition tends, I think, to be, in many people's imagination, sort of an invention of the 60s. But in fact, from the very beginning of the gallery, major loan exhibitions from abroad came to Washington to be displayed in the galleries in the West Building. This is a slide of the dedication of the West Building with President Roosevelt. And I show you now the East Building of the National Gallery, the other the bookend, if you will, of our physical complex, which opened in 1978 on a site across 4th Street, which was had been reserved by Mr. Mellon in relationship with the federal government for an expansion at some point in time. And it began with the idea to build an international center of learning with scholars' offices. And Gary, I know you're teaching right now, but if you wanted to come back, we would give you a window, which you could look out upon the Capitol. The idea of giving windows to scholars, of course, negates the whole purpose of scholarship, because they... So I'm not quite sure who wins on that one, but I do think the sequestration of sorts in a closed office does produce very interesting scholarship, more expeditiously than a window does. But this is another view looking at the so-called the crystals that are between the two buildings, which Mr. I.M. Pei designed the East Building, and of course it was his President Mitterrand of France who came to visit the East Building, seeing the East Building, which stimulated his commission to Pei to design the Louvre. I ask from time to time if these crystals had anything to do with the Great Glass Pyramid now in the middle of the Louvre, and of course everyone denies it, but it's hard to imagine that this wasn't referential in some way here. It was begun with, I said, with an idea to build an international center of learning with scholars' offices. And at the same time, a shortage of exhibition space in the West Building contributed to the final design. It was accepted as a gift to the nation by President Jimmy Carter at an exhibition, which the building opened. Also, many of you may remember the Splendors of Dresden that opened as the special exhibition along with it. I will have a little more to say about that a little bit later on, but it was an interesting presentation by President Carter, because he talked at that about the fact of how proud he was that there was no Ministry of Culture in the United States, that American museums effectively were their own ambassadors for America and for America's culture and the visual arts abroad, as opposed to the centralization in many of the countries. In this case, it was East Germany, because the Dresden show was precipitated by an establishment of diplomatic relations between the two countries. The Minister of Culture from Germany is one of those gentlemen sitting in the front row here, who I don't think was particularly interested in hearing that a Ministry of Culture was in some ways, at least in President Carter's opinion, not a good thing. But we don't have such a thing in this country, and I do believe that in a democracy which has stimulated the American idea of museums, which is in fact a very different concept than as museum as it evolved in Europe, because our collections and those here at the Walters and other countries are really formed as a result of private donations for the most part. Is that better? Sorry. But the development of the American Museum was a very different kind of evolution. This is a portrait of Andrew Mellon, who founded the gallery. And the founding of the gallery is a story that reflects on the important role of art as an asset to foreign relations. Andrew Mellon had frequented London throughout his life, often visiting the National Gallery in Trafalgar Square. And as Treasury Secretary during most of the 1920s, he's reported to have been embarrassed by Washington's paucity of cultural amenities when visiting dignitaries from abroad asked to see America's great art treasures. The best place to take them was, in fact, his own apartment. Thus, his idea of creating a national gallery for America as a gift to the nation began to take hold in his mind. This is another portrait of Andrew Mellon in his Massachusetts Avenue apartment, which is, if you're in Washington now, the Mellon apartments are where the National Trust headquarters are presently located. So from the gallery's earliest days, exhibitions from across the globe have been an integral part of our special exhibition schedule. And the very year the gallery opened in 1941, it exhibited a collection of Australian art spanning 3 centuries. In 1942, the gallery hosted an exhibition of Chilean contemporary art, which today boggles my mind, but nevertheless, that was one of the major exhibitions there. And the gambit of nations has broadened ever since. With the Chief Justice, the Secretary of State, and the Secretary of the Treasury on our Board of Trustees, the gallery is well positioned to serve as an international showcase and vehicle for cultural diplomacy. And I'd like to present to you this evening, to the Baltimore Council on Foreign Affairs, 5 areas that demonstrate the National Gallery's commitment to an international role. Those would be special exhibitions. I'll show you the slide of the Vermeer exhibition and the Vermeer lines. The lines were largely a result of the exhibition, but also heavily influenced by the fact that the federal government closed twice during the run of the Vermeer show. And during I would guess, one of the lower moments of the winter, we were able to reopen the Vermeer exhibition. It was the only part of the National Gallery that was open, and I think about the only thing in Washington at the time. So Vermeer became a sort of a grand symbol of sorts. But special exhibitions are central to the international role of the gallery. Research and scholarship, also. The conservation of works of art, interestingly, play a fascinating role. And education and visitor services. The extraordinary exhibitions held at the National Gallery in recent years, and I'll highlight many in just a moment, reflect the growing recognition by governments that the exchange of the art of nations both expresses and stimulates international understanding. Visitors' eyes were drawn upward. I hope upward. These are visitors. And we're going to draw their eyes upward right now to the Titian exhibition, the great ceiling of St. John the Evangelist on Patmos, which was a central piece, hard to ignore it really. You're looking really at a ceiling installation at the National Gallery of this great artist, and an installation which was, I think, a tour de force of exhibition design in many ways, as well as conviction that the ceiling itself would remain there during the tour of the exhibition. This was seen only in Washington, and it celebrated the 500th birthday of the Venetian Renaissance master. The Italian president, Francesco Cossiga, with the First Lady Barbara Bush, announced the exhibition during his visit to the National Gallery. The next exhibition, which I believe many of you would remember, was seen only in Washington, The Treasure Houses of Britain, 500 years of patronage and art collecting, which comprised 1,700 galleries displaying over 700 works from more than 20 country houses in England, Scotland, Wales, and Northern Ireland. It was seen by nearly 1 million visitors. I'm moving through a series of exhibitions now just to give you a flavor of the kind of programs that international exchange engenders and results from. This is a slide of the sculpture of Indonesia, which our designers created, in which they created rather temple-like settings for Buddhas carved from volcanic stone. This is the exhibition I think was mentioned a little bit earlier. This is the art of Aztec Mexico, the treasures of Tenochtitlan, which was the most comprehensive selection of Aztec art ever seen in the U.S., and it premiered at the National Gallery of Art. Having also just celebrated Columbus Day, I wanted to mention this exhibition, circa 1492, Art in the Age of Exploration, which documented the artistic achievements of major civilizations in Europe, Africa, Asia, and the Americas. This effort included 600 paintings, sculpture, drawings, tapestries, decorative arts, maps, scientific instruments, etc., from collections in 33 countries. It was the most wide-ranging exhibition in the gallery's 55-year history. International relations in some of these loan negotiations take, I think, on the magnitude of arms negotiations in foreign affairs sometimes, because asking lenders to part with major national treasures or private collectors to part with great works of art from their homes is occasionally a very lengthy and tedious affair. And for the right reasons, an exhibition of Titian, for instance, which would be the only one such thing, it can happen. For an exhibition celebrating this show, the Columbus show, another thing. of great international magnitude in which many countries wish to participate. Another matter indeed. It was a very eclectic exhibition, as you can see, with the globe, with paintings, with decorative arts, remarkable scientific instruments. Over a period of 27 days in 1963, with U.S. Marines on guard around the clock, over 500,000 people viewed Leonardo da Vinci's celebrated masterpiece, the Mona Lisa, which was lent by the government of France. There is a fascinating and very short but wonderful story. This was a gift to the American people as a personal loan from President Charles de Gaulle to President Kennedy, who called the National Gallery's director at that time, John Walker, to announce the loan and to simply say, "Please cope." Well, Mr. Walker coped, and the Leonardo in front of its Marine Guard, or in back of its Marine Guard, I should say, was enjoyed by a large population of Americans for, I think, the only time it has left the Louvre, and probably the only time it ever will. A joint congressional resolution established in 1988 as, quote, the Year of New Sweden, which was done to celebrate the 350th anniversary of the first Swedish settlement in North America, Christiana, which is now in Wilmington, Delaware, resulted in this exhibition. The centerpiece of a year-long celebration was the gallery's exhibition called Sweden, a Royal Treasury, 1550 to 1700. And more than 100 works from Swedish royal collections were exhibited. It was opened by King Carl XVI, Gustaf, and Queen Sylvia. Now, to inaugurate the opening of the East Building, as I mentioned a few moments ago, in 1978, the National Gallery presented more than 700 works from the former German Democratic Republic and the splendors of Dresden, 5 centuries of art collection. It was an absolutely remarkable exhibition, which I, at that time, was charged to be the coordinator of, and it got into some very interesting dialogue between the Germans and the United States side, because it was the first effort that came after the establishment of formal relations between our countries. And the exhibition was huge. It was also the first exhibition that was indemnified by our government. The indemnity program is something worth mentioning because it was established at about this time and hoped to stimulate the cultural exchange between the United States and foreign countries. It was intended at that time to cover foreign loans to the United States. Now it does cover both foreign loans as well as exhibitions from the United States which go abroad. And it is an indemnity to cover the costs should there be any loss. Well, this is the first exhibition that was indemnified, and I had the sort of dubious distinction, I guess, of sort of nudging this thing along. And it turned out that the value of the exhibition exceeded the value of the indemnity, and we didn't know quite what to do about that, so we ended up finally working it out so that the value of the indemnity would be declared a deductible in the case of loss. And it was rather fascinating. What to me was interesting was the dialogue that occurred as a result of this between our colleagues in Germany and those of us at the gallery, because none of us had really ever seen each other. We hadn't had any dialogue with the bloc countries in any serious way. And the couriers who came over and occupied offices with windows in the gallery from Germany were rather interesting. And at the time, my family had a place up on Cape Cod, and I invited one of the representatives of the German group to come up for a weekend, and he did. And we had a fascinating time talking, and what I did learn from him was the fact that Americans are terribly politically naive, that there in Germany all they talk about are politics. And he went on, this was in 1978, to talk about the reunification of Germany, the fact that the bloc countries would disintegrate in a very short time and that it would begin in Poland. I remember the conversation very, very vividly because everything that he told me in that conversation came true in years afterwards, and I thought at the time it was a fairly preposterous conversation indeed, and that he might have had a little more Jack Daniels than he probably should have. But it was a very, very interesting and I think dramatic moment. The Dresden exhibition in some ways changed the development of the large blockbuster exhibitions and also in some ways gave it definition. It might surprise some of you to learn how closely linked the gallery's international exhibitions are with the country's international relations. Some shows, and I will show you some now, have been the direct result of the meetings of heads of state. For example, the idea for the 1988-89 exhibition called Japan, The Shaping of Daimyo Culture, was introduced at a summit meeting between President Ronald Reagan and Prime Minister Yoshihiro Nakasone. There was a public announcement that was made in Washington in October of 1987 in conjunction with the visit of His Majesty the Emperor Akihito and Her Majesty Empress Michiko. This is a slide of the Daimyo show, which I believe some of you probably are very familiar with. The cooperation of the business communities, cultural institutions, governments, and national leaders was essential in organizing the exhibition. I'll show you here the other extreme from the Western culture, Henry Matisse's Harmony in Red, which was among the Impressionist and early modern paintings lent to the National Gallery from the former Soviet Union's two greatest museums, the State Hermitage Museum in St. Petersburg, then Leningrad, and the Pushkin State Museum of Fine Arts in Moscow in the summer of 1986, before the fall of the Berlin Wall. It was extremely exciting for visitors here because it included works never before seen in America and was organized under the honorary patronage of our First Lady Betty Ford. And a State Department official was quoted in the New York Times as saying, "We think this is an extraordinary exhibition and is one of the first fruits of the Geneva Summit. We expect that it will be one among many to follow." So as Andrew Mellon had wanted, the National Gallery of Art did and continues to and often welcomes visiting heads of state as an integral part of the official visit. This is Prince Charles looking with the curator Jervis Jackson Stokes at the treasure houses of Britain. Queen Sophia of Spain with First Lady Nancy Reagan toured the gallery in 1981. Here shown with John Wilmerding, who was then deputy director of the gallery, has gone on to distinction and a chair at Princeton University. The Secretary General of the United Nations, Javier Pérez de Cuellar, visited in 1990. And when the President of Italy visited in 1982, he made a point to see the gallery's Ginevra de' Benci, the only painting by the Renaissance master Leonardo da Vinci in the Western Hemisphere. During Mikhail Gorbachev's historic meeting with President Reagan in December of 1987, Raisa Gorbachev toured the gallery with Board of Trustees President Jack Stevenson. And more recently, with the Vermeer exhibition and the opening last November, and the closing last November, and the opening in December, and the closing in December, and then the opening in January, Queen Beatrix and Prince Klaus made a special trip to the United States to officially open the exhibition. This is a slide of Crown Prince Akihito, who is now the Emperor of Japan, attending the opening of The Shaping of Daimyo Culture with his wife, Empress Michiko, again with then Board President Jack Stevenson. The process of assembling an exhibition is a lengthy labor of love for all involved. As I have touched on, in inaugurating international exhibitions, the National Gallery negotiates with foreign governments, oversees transportation, conservation, and installation, and commissions research and publishes scholarly catalogs. And I'd like briefly just to elaborate on some of the exhibitions that are particularly noteworthy and which best illustrate the weaving together of art and foreign policy. This requires the close involvement and participation at the highest levels of government, and often we work closely with the country's Ministry of Culture. The Portuguese government, I show you here the Baroque coach, which was in the exhibition we did 3 years ago with Portugal. The Portuguese government and private citizens shared their masterpieces with the American public on the occasion of this exhibition, which was a collaborative undertaking between the National Gallery and the Portuguese Secretary of State for Culture. It was the first major exhibition sent to the United States from Portugal, and featured works created during the 18th century, a period of great prosperity and richness. The works of art had, by and large, remained in Portuguese public and private collections and had never traveled before here or to any other country. This elaborate coach, which we didn't do the horses, but the coach itself was quite a remarkable tour de force of craftsmanship and art from that period, and it figured prominently in the grand ceremonies of Baroque Portugal. The goddess Selkut was one of 55 astonishing objects lent by the Arab Republic of Egypt for the 1976-77 exhibition, Treasures of Tutankhamun, which was the first exhibition I had the honor to coordinate at the National Gallery. It was rather interesting in a way because when I was asked to come to the gallery, I was a professor at the University of Texas at the time, Carter Brown said, "Can you please be here by September because we have this big Egyptian show coming and we need you to take care of this for the gallery." So I hustled up and I got there. I said, "What for?" And he said, "Well, one of the reasons we need you is because the Navy's bringing the exhibition." I said, "Well, what problem is that?" He said, "Well, we don't know how to deal with the Navy, and you used to be in the Navy, so we think your expertise may be relevant here." Well, the Navy did a great job bringing the exhibition over, and it was seen by hundreds of thousands of people. It went on, I think, to 7 different sites in the United States, and the goddess Selkut, the lovely lady in gold, here was one of the centerpieces of it. I used to, at that time, take important figures through on tours, and President Carter's mother, remember Miss Lillian, came to the exhibition one day, and I was asked to take her through, and we came into the exhibition, which had the great Tut mask in front of it, and she stopped and was very silent, and she grabbed my arm and she said, you can feel the spirit." So it was a powerfully moving experience for many people, and I think accomplished exactly what it was meant to in many ways. It was a great exhibition. This is another one of the Tut objects. Negotiations for the exhibition had begun several years before its opening, during a time when official diplomatic relations with Egypt had been suspended. Secretary of State Henry Kissinger, also a gallery trustee ex officio, headed up these discussions, securing an agreement with the Egyptian foreign minister for the loan of the 55 objects from the Cairo Museum, and in his spare time would broker international peace treaties and trade agreements. Similarly, negotiations for loans for this exhibition from the People's Republic of China 22 years ago had begun in the absence of official relations between our two countries. The flying horse of Kansu, which I show you here, from the 1st century AD, was one of the most breathtaking objects in what was called archaeological finds from the People's Republic of China, which came to the gallery in 1974. Again, it was Henry Kissinger who, through his secret visits to Beijing, then called Peking, had laid the necessary groundwork to secure these loans. When the Shanghai communique was issued following President Nixon's visit in 1972, we learned that the exhibition would be coming to America, and soon after learned that it would be opening here in the nation's capital. The State Department worked out negotiations in Beijing and completed and signed the agreements only weeks before the objects themselves arrived in chartered jets under heavy guard. This is a charter jet under heavy guard, and this is the Allied movers who very, very carefully and gently brought the works of art to the National Gallery. At the trustees' opening night dinner, First Lady Betty Ford previewed the exhibition with Paul Mellon and Chinese diplomats, as we had then established relations with the Chinese Republic. More recently and presently on view at the gallery, Olmec art of ancient Mexico, which will be here, it will be in Washington through October 20th, and then will then disperse to its lenders, is another example of the importance of relations between our country and that of Mexico. This is the first comprehensive exhibition of Olmec art ever presented. It is a panoramic view of the artistic achievements of Mexico's earliest and least known civilization. There are 120 objects in this exhibition, including this colossal head from San Lorenzo, which weighs slightly more than 10.5 tons. I'm told the heaviest object ever displayed at the National Gallery. We had to reinforce the floor with steel beams just to set the object in its exhibition presentation. The Olmec Exhibition presents the remarkable beginnings of pre-Columbian art and provides an opportunity to view some of the most glorious early art of this hemisphere. And you can still see this in Washington if you come over. It was a project requiring the close cooperation of many in the United States and Mexico. The diplomatic corps here and in Mexico City, our ambassador there, James Johnson, has been very helpful in this effort. Scholars in Mexico and scholars here have been very instrumental in making possible the loan of many of these great objects. It's the first time that objects both from Mexico and from non-Mexican sources have been shown together. The agreements we were able to conclude with our Mexican colleagues, I think also have now finally established a precedent on which other objects or other exhibitions showing objects from both countries will be possible now in the future. This is another view of the what's called the Venta Hoard. They look huge. It's a rather wonderful slide, but they're rather small objects. We have really no idea what kind of ceremony they were presenting or participating in, but it's rather similar in many ways to the questions about Stonehenge. We just don't know about them. What we do know is they are extremely powerful objects and very, very compelling indeed. I would like to conclude the role of special exhibitions play with showing you a few slides from an upcoming exhibition, The Splendors of Imperial China, Treasures from the National Palace Museum in Taipei. This is our first exhibition in the new year. It will be on at the gallery from January 19th through April 6th, and is the first comprehensive presentation of Chinese masterworks throughout the country's imperial history from Taipei. It has been preceded by only two great Chinese art exhibitions from Taipei in the West. There was one in 1935 and 36 in London. And 24 years later, just after the close of the Second World War, the gallery again premiered in the summer of 1961 another exhibition sponsored by the government of the Republic of China. It was not until late 1991 that an exhibition of the very best works of art from the National Palace Museum's collection was capable of becoming a reality, and formed what is the most wide-ranging exhibition of Chinese art ever held in order to tell the story of the 5,000-year history of Chinese civilization, and very much a joint scholarly project of the staffs of the Metropolitan Museum of Art and the National Palace Museum in Taipei. The approval by both the executive and legislative branches of the Taipei government, this is another one of the slides from the exhibition, constituted a recognition of the importance of the exhibition to both Chinese and American art communities. The aim is to enhance the American public's appreciation of Chinese culture and provide a better understanding of China's long struggle to preserve and develop its cultural and historic heritage. This is another one of the slides, and one of the bronzes. It's a very, very wide-ranging exhibition. It was shown in New York, has been to Chicago, San Francisco, and the gallery will close the exhibition in January. There's another tidbit. As you have seen, the gallery serves as a catalyst for the international exchange of art, cultural, and scholarship. Scholarship and research form the cornerstone of our international programs. I show you here the Center for Advanced Study in the Visual Arts and the library at the gallery, which brings together scholars from two research communities, universities and museums, who utilize the gallery's resources, including the libraries and archives. The library was based on an idea that had long simmered at the gallery from its first director, David Finley, through John Walker to Carter Brown, which I was privileged to inherit, but was established in 1978, or just after the opening of the East Building, which was formed on the basis of the great Library of Antiquity in Alexandria and Bernard Berenson's Villa I Tatti in Florence. The center is a resident community of scholars that is virtually unique among American museums. And among its numerous scholarly activities, the center provides funds and facilities for postdoctoral research in the history of art, selecting participants from institutions worldwide. This is a window, and if Gary were to come back, we could provide him with a window to do further scholarship, but one of our scholars consulting with one of our foreign colleagues. Behind the scenes at the gallery, scientists and conservators conduct research and aptly innovative scientific techniques to the safekeeping of works of art. In the past years, more than 20 postgraduate fellows in conservation have represented 8 nations. The Conservation Center is one of the finest in the world and is a credit that many foreign lenders allow us to care for their works being put on view in an exhibition. This happens to be a photograph of our conservator cleaning the varnish off the Leonardo's Ginevra da Vinci in our collections. And another, David Bull, the conservator, working on the Bellini Feast of the Gods. The National Gallery's database on its own collections offers students, scholars, and the public the opportunity to explore the permanent collection and serves as a model system for sharing information internationally. In addition, we have extension services which distribute films, videotapes, slides, and other educational resources to an audience of more than 33 million people in this country, as well as abroad to embassies, American schools, and armed forces bases. Our annual Summer Teacher Institute and our various intern programs usually include those from abroad. This is not a teacher, this is a child looking at a Gauguin in the National Gallery collections, which I think is fundamental to the whole experience of all museums. One of our docents, foreign visitors, and the rotunda of the National Gallery. So for over 30 years, the gallery has inaugurated a program of guided tours in foreign languages to complement those given in English by our staffs. The volunteers are trained by gallery staff and conduct tours today in 10 languages, including Chinese, Japanese, Dutch, Greek, Hebrew, Russian, French, German, Italian, and Spanish, and I hope I haven't offended anyone by leaving their language out, but we think we do a fairly good job covering the globe. So it has been for all of us a great joy to see Mr. Mellon's dream realized in the National Gallery as it stands today, where our nation's treasures are available for all to study, but we also bring from abroad, as well as send abroad, works of great consequence in exhibitions that we believe and hope have relevance for our audience. At the world's great art institutions, the international exchange of art is not motivated by finances. It is a step removed from the division of politics and illustrates the differences among us while celebrating the similarities. As this council knows, the value of these efforts, I hope, are limitless. Thank you very much. I've probably outworn your patience, but I'd be glad to take any questions you may have about these programs. I also can't see you because of these lights that are on. So, yes, ma'am, I can. How in the world did they transport that heavy Olmec head? Very carefully. It obviously didn't fly, but it was specially rigged and transported overland. It took, I believe, 18 hours to get it from the truck into the gallery to set it up. We have actually a video on that, which is, I think, I thought it would be tedious, but it's one of the more compelling things, moving it inch by inch. The professionalism that we have developed and others about transporting works of art is something that's truly remarkable. As I understand it, that's two questions. One about the Berlin exhibition. That was an exhibition that I believe was around 1950 or 1951 at the Gallery of Works of Art that had been part of the Third Reich holdings. I was in grammar school at the time, and I don't really know that I can comment too much about that, but it was an enormously popular exhibition. The works were returned, and I believe, as far as I know, subsequently all dispersed back to the sources from which they came. the Vermeer exhibition, there was one painting, as I understand it, that was not part of the exhibition here. That painting was from the Rijksmuseum, and that painting that did not come here had been stolen at one point, ripped from its canvas, and had been recently restored and put back in the Rijksmuseum, and I think they were understandably reluctant to part with it, largely for conservation reasons.
Sir, you implied that you have somehow been above politics, and that's laudable, but many of us have been dismayed